adjust LI. So we have our first poll up there. Here's our second poll. Let's see who was in the room. And we're just going to go with the census information. We know that this is not as specific as it might be, but if everyone could please answer now, that'd be great. Another few seconds.
Yeah, I'll be like 5 years behind.
And then another question. What is your gender identity?
Oh, cool. Not bad.
More females than males. But are the males online? I think we have more males than what's listed on there. And one last one. What town or community do you live in?
Oh, this is cool. Oh,
Lots coming in there.
Wow.
Okay, us.
So we have a lot of people from Setauket.
Yeah.
Brooklyn.
So I wonder who had to drive the furthest. I wonder who had to drive the furthest. I see somebody from one of the Hamptons. I don't know if we have anybody further than that.
Monticello.
Where?
Monticello. Onto Jamaica.
Oh, Jamaica.
Onto Jamaica, Monticello.
Monticello.
Someone came from upstate.
Okay. I'm going to cut that off at the moment, but that's very interesting. A lot of people came from a lot of different places to get here. So our focus this evening is really talking about structural racism. And by the time you leave, if you haven't heard that term before, you're going to have a good idea what it is, because the panel, and I will kick it off. We'll be giving you examples. You'll be able to see what it looks like, see how it permeates, and see how we're perpetuating it. So this first slide that you're going to see is a map of our school districts. And Long Island is among the 10 most racially segregated metro regions in the country. And even though we are becoming more diverse, that doesn't mean that we have what we want going on in our schools, which you'll see in a moment. I'm going to give you a couple of snapshots of Long Island. And take a look at this. Long Island is comprised of two counties, 2 cities, 13 towns, 95 villages, and 125 school districts. So you're getting the picture, I hope, about the fragmentation here. We have 665 government entities. And we're home to approximately 2.8 million people, so we're not a little place, but tremendously fragmented. And here's a snapshot of us racially looking at the two counties. Now I noticed that we had 60% white here. I think it was something like 14 or 16% Hispanic or Latinx, 4% bi or multiracial, 15% African American, and 4% Asian in terms of who was in the room, as compared to what we have on our screen there for Long Island's demographics. But I think it's interesting that we managed, despite the severe segregation, to have some diversity in this room, which is great. Now with the schools, we did some research looking at 2004 to 2016 to see what happened with the demographics of the student population. And what this is showing you is that when you're looking at majority and minority districts that are intensely segregated, meaning 90 to 100% non-white, we had a tripling of the number of students that are attending in those districts. And then when we looked at the districts, we started with 5 and we ended with 11. So more than a doubling. Just to give you an idea of the level of segregation that is continuing here on Long Island and in our schools in particular. So with that said, just giving you a little bit of a backdrop, we're going to have our panelists come up and we're going to get started with some of the presentations. So if you come on up, panel.
Okay, so there's not enough room to sit down, so I'm going to sit down. We'll make it.
So our first speaker tonight is Dr. Christopher Seller, and as I mentioned, he is the director of the center that is co-hosting this event. He's a history professor at Stony Brook University, and his research focuses on the history of environment and health, of cities and industries, of inequality, that includes racial and economic as well as environmental, and democracy, with a focus on the United States and Mexico. Dr. Sellers is the author of numerous titles, which include Hazards of the Job, The Nature of the Firm, and more recent works, Crabgrass, Crucible, and Toxic Crossings. He is the founder of Environment and Health Network, as well as Enviro Health. He received his PhD from Yale University and his MD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Sellers didn't have enough to do. So please help me welcome Dr. Sellers.
See, in terms of getting my slideshow up there, whoever it is that
Just keep going.
took it, yeah.
You just click. Yeah,
Oh, it's on there?
Yeah.
Oh,
There it is.
oh, there I am.
There.
But I had a slideshow too.
Keep going.
Oh, it's there. Oh, why, oh, great. I'm so pleased. I'm so pleased that to see you all here. Also, so pleased to be organizing and shepherding through this event with. Oh. erase racism. This has kind of been a dream of mine for quite a while, and now with this new center, we're able to. We're finally able to do it, to collaborate. My charge today is to introduce this notion of scientific racism and to sketch some take-home points of just what it has to do with structural racism and what we confront on Long Island today. Now, while I speak in part as an historian long interested in America's racial divides, my own interest in this topic has actually been shaped by the other side of my background as a physician. I have a long-standing interest in the history of biomedicine. And in the great catalog of science's historical abuses, its handling of race ranks right up at the top. So what is scientific racism? It names a term to scientific method and authority to elaborate or defend a set of ideas that have long been fundamental to racist thinking, that some groups of people are inherently superior to others. Generally, the most favored groups, oddly enough, look most like the scientist who is speaking. For proof, scientific racists appeal to whatever demonstrations their discipline allows to assert superiority or inferiority as hardwired and objective truth. And classically, they point to the bodies and brains of the people they study to make it that the difference is irremediable and seemingly inheritable, passed along from generation to generation. But there is a social science variant as well that I'll go into a little bit less today. Pondered long and stubborn record of scientific racism sheds important light on the resurgent public and explicit racism across America today. Long Island's not been exempt from that. In our own, as in other eras of resurgent racism, it becomes all too easy to blame those who are less couth and lower class and the demagogues who stir them up. Yet, one of the benefits of looking at this particular topic is that for centuries it shows scientific elites, the people in the upper echelons, were at the forefront of efforts to understand racial differences as reflections of a permanent and natural hierarchy, justifying their own racist rule. Scientific racism is as old as Western science itself. It had its first heyday in the Enlightenment of the 18th, 19th centuries. It was exemplified by this Frenchman, Georges Cuvier, who his work, as others in the Enlightenment, came in the wake of an age of exploration that had opened European eyes to the great variety of humanity around our planet. And mapping out the kingdom of animals, Cuvier and his colleagues preoccupied themselves also with establishing how different non-European humans were from the Europeans, who, not coincidentally, were now bent on conquering, colonizing, and enslaving them. Starting with the most superficial contrast like skin color, Cuvier then thought to penetrate more deeply by looking at human skulls. He's the guy who coined the term Caucasian from bones he acquired from the Caucasus region in Central Europe. He decided they represented the white race to which civilized people of Europe belonged, which was the first and best version of humanity. Listening to nature, he called it. He thought he discovered there not only in these skulls the race that was the most beautiful, but also that was superior in its genius, courage, and activity. And by contrast, you can see what he had to say about the Negro race, the hordes of which it consists have always remained in the most complete state of barbarism. So it went with 19th century scientific racism. Some other images here. Countercurrents did emerge, including Cuvier's own student who came back from Africa with conflicting evidence. But for the most part, entire generations of scientists showed great determination to nail down the racists as having real biological essence and difference. And from the turn of the late 19th into the early 20th century, a new American vein of scientific racism arose, with Long Island actually as its seat. Taking over the early kernel of what became the Cold Spring Harbor Lab in 1898, Charles Davenport, a young Harvard-trained biologist, turned it into an intellectual hub for a new science of racial supremacy dubbed eugenics. He lived and worked on Long Island's white, wealthy Gold Coast at this time. He was a scientist who responded not just to the Negro question, but to a new wave of immigration, an unprecedented wave of new immigrants were finding their way to the U.S. mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe. They worried Davenport and his white Protestant elite colleagues. They were worried about their race's future fate. At his newly founded eugenics records office, he collected information on the genealogies of thousands of families in search of a new quantitatively based science of racial heredity. Their quite explicit hope was to develop an understanding and set of tools that could be actively and explicitly used to shield their own, they called it white germplasm, from dilution. And so it should come as no surprise that Davenport was also an outspoken advocate for immigration restriction and applauded the legislation of the 1920s that actually accomplished this. Eugenicists also advocated for still harsher measures like the forced sterilization of those whom they deemed unfit. Now, more recently, the scientific racists have been mostly discredited by newer findings in biology. This new molecular understanding and a kind of anti-racist science have largely won the day. So now we understand those physical differences, such as skin color, as really minor differences compared to the far-reaching genetic variations to be found within any of these supposed racial groups. Put another way, they understand race is biologically much less significant and largely skin deep. But just to bring this discussion back around to structural racism today, that hasn't meant that racio-ethnic inequalities have gotten any less real. Over the last century, since the classic civil rights movement, we've actually seen the rise of reported color blindness that itself can be understood as another variant of racism. By purporting not to see race at all, whole new strands of science, law, and policy have turned blind eyes to the starkly unequal legacies that persist from these centuries of all too racist understanding. They've done so even as, in a place like Long Island, those inequities live on in our landscapes, cultures, and lives. Thank you. Oh, there's another Davenport slide.
Our next speaker is Dr. Abina Asare. Dr. Asare is Assistant Professor of Africana Studies and History at Stony Brook University. Her research and writing span questions of human rights, citizenship, and transformative justice in Africa and the African diaspora. Her work can be found in The Radical Teacher, the International Journal of Crime, Justice, and Social Democracy, African Arguments, and Foreign Policy in Focus, among many other places. She is the author of Truth Without Reconciliation, A Human Rights History of Ghana. That's the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2018. And in 2018-2019, she will be Scholar in Residence at the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Please welcome Dr. Asare.
Hello, everybody. I am Abina Asare, and I'm really honored to be here with all of you, gathering together around this hard but hopeful question, right? How to build a just Long Island. So this question of justice is not only academic. It's not just about the laws that we have in place. It's also deeply personal, right? It requires that we bring our whole selves into the room. after all of our ideas about what makes a good school, what makes a safe town, all of the identities that we've created here on Long Island, our personal histories, influence what we see as justice and how willing and able we are to fight for it. So I've been asked today to talk about historiography, about how history is written and expressed, and more specifically, about how history and its representation relates to the persistence of structural racism within Long Island. So interpreting the past, I would argue, is a main ground of battle in this fight for a more just Long Island. Many of the policies in our region that insulate and reproduce structural racism. Now here I'm speaking particularly of our segregated schools and towns, our lack of public transportation, and other land use choices are based on a false narrative of what Long Island was, of who it was for, and a fear of where it is going. Now, because particular versions of history underlie these policies that perpetuate inequality, creating new futures requires that we expose the versions of the past that justify our separate and unequal status quo. Allow me to give you an example. There's a story that I've heard again and again ever since I moved here about 8 years ago, that this area was previously a safe area before problems came in from outside, right? Now, the problem with this story is that it completely erases the racialized terror that is as much a part of our history here as the tree-lined streets and the lovely beaches. There is a history of state violence against Black households, which is explained by Yancey Ford in their award-winning documentary, Strong Island. There is a history in which assault against Central and South American immigrants was seen as sport for youth in some of our towns. There's a history of human rights abuses which are occurring in our local jails, and it's still occurring today as detailed in an ongoing federal lawsuit launched by the NYCLU. There's a history of hate as pop culture right here in our area, as I discovered last year. Just last year, a local fire department proudly displayed these images of a flag that stands for the dehumanization of people of African descent on their website until we raised a fuss, and then they took them down. This too is the history of Long Island. And this notion that Long Island was always peaceful before ignores the way that this safety has never been extended to all of us. Allow me to give you another example. I have recently learned that some classrooms on the island still teach what I described to my 5-year-old son as the fake story of Thanksgiving. So there are classrooms that invite children to wear Indian headdresses and beads, that indoctrinate our kids into settler identities before they know how to read. There are classrooms that invite our kids to perceive the indigenous communities in our midst as props in a national myth rather than as human beings with value who are still here. This matters for those of us who would build a just Long Island, because entirely different conversations about land use, about immigration, about the right to labor result when we can ask the fundamental question, what does it mean to live justly on stolen land? There's a cost to these exclusionary histories that make it difficult for us to know, understand, and respect our fellow neighbors. There's a cost to continuing to teach histories that make it difficult for our kids to embrace the cultural richness that surrounds them. There's a cost to clutching on to versions of the past that make us blind to discrimination and blind also to the ways that people have always struggled to make this place beautiful still. So I am thinking here of the history of the Eastern Farm Workers Association, of the Gordon Heights Association, of the Bethel Hobbs Farm. I'm thinking of the high school students that I met recently at an Erase Racism event, students from Brentwood and Central Islip, who told me with pride and love about their schools, right? These are histories that we do not hear often in the public sphere. Stories of the success, the creativity, and the institutions which have been built by people of color on Long Island. And our ignorance of them hinders our ability to dream a different future. So this work of justice is not only about the future, it's also about the past. Telling the story of a place always involves choices. Whose voices matter? Whose experiences are placed at the center? How willing are we to confront the violence of the history we have learned and pursue new stories about the complex world and our place within it? Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Crystal Marie Fleming. Is Associate Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies and Associate Faculty in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at SUNY Stony Brook. She is an author, cultural critic, and educator committed to empowering people with the conceptual tools needed to understand, confront, and challenge white supremacy and intersectional oppression. Dr. Fleming has conducted research on racism and anti-racism in multiple national contexts and collaborated on empirical projects in the United States, France, Brazil, and Israel. She holds a PhD and a master's degree in sociology from Harvard University and graduated with honors in sociology and French from Wellesley University. Her scholarship appears in journals such as the Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Poetics, Dubois Review, Social Science Research on Race and Mindfulness. Her new book, How to Be Less Stupid About Race, on Racism, White Supremacy, and the Racial Divide, combines memoir, critical race theory, social commentary, and satire to debunk common misconceptions about racism. The book will be published.
It's published.
It is published.
It's out.
And is now available for pre-order. Nope, they can get
Order
it at the
everywhere.
store.
Yeah.
Order everywhere. Help me welcome, please, Dr. Crystal Marie Fleming.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here, honored to join my colleagues, and thank you, Erase Racism. And thank you all for making time to be here. You could have been many other places, but I have the sense that most, if not all of you, are here because you want to build a just Long Island. And so what I'm going to speak about, my task is to address issues of culture and media and kind of explain what that has to do with systemic racism. And as Elaine said, my work also is about specifically understanding these terms and understanding these matters in terms of white supremacy. So I'm going to share with you, yes, of course, shameless plug for the book. It's true, it's available in bookstores and on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, wherever you need to go. I'm going to talk to you about, of course, racist imagery in our society, but again, link it to an understanding of white supremacy. Part of what I try to do in the book, How to Be Less Stupid About Race, as well as in my teaching and writing, is to help shift the national conversation from this very narrow understanding of white supremacy, right? Many people think of white supremacy as the KKK, or neo-Nazis, or white nationalists. And listen, white supremacy is that as well, but I define white supremacy in my work as the social, political, and economic dominance of people socially defined as white. So there's a lot in that definition, but what I want you to retain is that white supremacy is not just the KKK. It's the way our society has been structured since its inception to benefit people who are socially defined as white, knowing that that category has shifted over time and it continues to be socially constructed, right? We know these terms are made up by human beings. And when we talk about systemic racism, it's very rare that we're very clear that there's only been one system of racism institutionalized in our society. It's not black supremacy. It's not Native American supremacy. It's not Asian supremacy. It's white supremacy. And so I think unless we have that kind of clarity in our discussions, we're not going to be able to make the kinds of transformative change that I know many of us in this room seek. So I want to talk about history, and I think it's very fitting that my colleagues have already set that context. You know, I have up on the screen, I've called it this kind of imaginative archive of white supremacy. What are we talking about when we talk about the history of racist representations? We have everything from, and for some of you in the back might be hard to see, but there's this image of a white, almost angelic woman floating across the plains. Some of you might know that this is an image associated with the idea of manifest destiny, right? On whose land are we? We are on indigenous land. And so the idea that whites, particularly white men, but here we see how white women have been central to the project of white supremacy as well, but the idea that whites are entitled to this land, right? That has been part of the bedrock of our nation's culture. We need to be very clear about that. This is not just an extremist ideology that is white supremacy. It has been the cultural bedrock of our nation, even since before its inception. Elaine mentioned that some of my work explores racism as well as white supremacy in other national settings. My first book was about racism in France. One of the differences between the United States and European nations is that our country was actually built on white supremacy, whereas European nations existed before the establishment of chattel slavery and European colonialism. In our case, we were built on it. To give you a concrete example, you know, the issue of documentation and citizenship right now is very politically salient. Let me tell you, we used to have a problem in this country with undocumented people. There were hordes of undocumented Europeans who were in the newly created nation of the United States. And what do you think we did in the 1700s, late 1700s, when we had this new country, all these undocumented white people? What are we going to do with them? Do you know what we did with them? We made them citizens. This country's very first immigration law, the Naturalization Act of 1790, gave citizenship to free white persons. And at that time, that category of free white persons, it excluded white women, right? Who would have to, if they were undocumented, they would have to get citizenship through marriage to a white man. And so in so many ways, right, when I talk about white supremacy as the social, political, and economic dominance of people socially defined as white, what we're talking about is a culture of white entitlement, right? Not just entitlement to land, but entitlement to wealth, to citizenship, to voting rights, to power. That's what white supremacy is. And that is something, unfortunately, that has not changed, even though we have had laws, right, that have transformed our country. We've had civil rights movements that are ongoing. We've had one non-white president, at least one who identifies that way, even though he's biracial. Let me tell you something about the fact that we've had a black president. Many people in our society still believe that if you had a black president one time, racism's over. Well, when Barack Obama was still president, back in 2016, let's talk about Washington, D.C. The economic gap in wealth between white households and black households in Washington, D.C., when we had a black president, white households in D.C. had 81 times the wealth of black families. In the District of Columbia, with a black president in the White House. And so it's important to see both what's changed and not changed. And what is not changed, I argue in my book, is the underlying structure of white supremacy, as well as the culture that birthed it in the first place. Another image I have up on the screen now, when I saw this for the first time, I kind of thought it kind of looks like a composite sketch of like a serial killer. But in fact, what this is, this black and white pixelated image of a slightly smiling, youngish white man. This is what, in 2018, white Americans think God looks like. Researchers at the University of North Carolina asked a sample of white Christians, what does God look like? And they described God as looking like this. What do you... 2018, y'all, not 1818, not 1718. 2018, and so what do you think happens in hiring decisions when people go around thinking that's what God looks like? What do you think happens, right, when people are deciding where to live, when they associate moral goodness and godliness with being a white man? What do you think happens when people are deciding who gets a loan or not, who gets access to resources and opportunities or not, who marries into a certain family or not, when people go around with this white supremacist culture in their hearts and minds? Okay, before we get to implicit bias, I'm just going to close by saying, I think that if we're going to build the kind of anti-racist change we seek, we need to be brave and talk frankly about these matters. It's important to talk about systemic racism. It's important to talk about structural racism. But we need to be clear, the only kind of systemic racism that's ever been institutionalized in our culture, and our education, and in our politics, and our economy, is the culture of white supremacy. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Our final speaker is Miriam Suwana. Miriam Suwana is currently a graduate student in the social health area at Stony Brook University. She earned her BS in psychology at the University of Colorado, Denver. Her research interests include race and gender intersectionality and understanding how individuals utilize adaptive mechanisms to cope with social identity threat. Please help me welcome Miriam Suwana.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm really honored to be here. So, is there a way to lower this a little bit? Oh, perfect. Thank you. Perfect. As Elaine mentioned, I am. I am a social psychologist, and I do research on how marginalized individuals cope with bias and discrimination. And I'm going to be talking to you guys today about implicit bias. So as everyone's been pointing out, structural racism is pretty pervasive and widely impacting. We see that structural racism disadvantages minority citizens in the context of education. For example, with lower high school graduation rates being seen among minority communities. We see this with the school to prison pipeline, which if you've heard of that, which is this thing that disproportionately funnels public school students of color into the juvenile justice system. We see this with issues of food security, we see this with issues of environmental justice, and we see this with issues of socioeconomic mobility. So even on Long Island, we see that non-whites on the island are nearly 5 times as likely as whites on the island to be arrested on charges resulting from traffic stops and even charges related to drug possession arrests. So even though the studies do show us that white individuals and minorities use drugs at about the same rate. And non-whites make up about 30% of the population, but account for more than 60% of some of these charges. One factor that contributes to the heavy prevalence of these issues is implicit bias. Implicit bias refers to these subtle and subconscious beliefs that affect our understanding of certain groups of people, how we act towards them, and the decisions that we make regarding these groups. So we have a bias then when, rather than feeling neutral about a specific group or positively, we have this aversion to a person or a group of people. And these biases are influenced by all the social, political, and cultural forces in our lives and can be influenced both directly and indirectly. So, for example, what we see in research is a few different things. So, a white adult, let's say, has little or no interaction with African Americans. Starting in childhood, this person may be bombarded with distorted negative images of African Americans on television and in the news, and be exposed to negative comments about people of color. This can be from family members and other people who are respected by this individual, for example, teachers, law enforcement officials, etc. This input can lead to the development of unfounded negative attitudes about African Americans. An important thing to note is that this phenomenon has the power to influence policies and conditions in the real world. It negatively impacts the opportunity that minority groups can actually have to be successful. So for example, we see in research that elementary school teachers at times may say and explicitly believe that they have equal expectations for all of their students. However, implicit racial bias may lower these teachers' expectations of their students of color, which in fact can stimulate subtle differences in the ways that these teachers behave towards the students and lowers the academic performance as a result of the students. In the criminal justice system, implicit racial bias can actually negatively influence decisions made by judges. So for example, research on capital punishment shows that killers of white victims are more likely to be sentenced to death than are killers of black victims, and that black defendants are more likely than white defendants to receive the death penalty. Other research shows that defendants with more Afrocentric facial features are given longer sentences than defendants with fewer Afrocentric features. So research really shows us that these negative racial associations can lead people to see danger or even a weapon where none might exist. There's a concept called shooter bias that highlights how much people associate African Americans with violence and weapons. So in these studies, participants are asked to make quick, split-second decisions about whether they're going to discharge a weapon for self-protection. This research has established that many people stereotypically associate African Americans with violence and weapons, causing them in these simulations to fire guns more often when presented with images of unarmed black people and less often when facing images of armed white individuals. Even in healthcare, we see studies that show us that black patients are often prescribed less pain medication than white patients who present the same complaints. And what we see is when we put participants in these same conditions, they end up doing the same thing that physicians are likely to do in the real world. And black patients with signs of heart problems get referrals for advanced cardiovascular procedures less than white patients with the same symptoms. Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely than white women to die from pregnancy-related causes nationwide, and one study found that African American infants were more than 9 times more likely than white babies to be given formula in the hospital. And this is important because breastfeeding is the best way to feed these babies. And so African American moms are usually not recommended to do so. And as a consequence, we see that infant mortality in minority-dominated neighborhoods, even in Long Island, are higher than in white-dominated neighborhoods. For example, infant mortality rates in neighborhoods like Uniondale are 13 times higher than infant mortality rates in neighborhoods like East Meadow. We also see evidence of implicit bias in the treatment of employed people of color and in hiring decisions. And we see this both with actual employers and with people who are not in a position to employ, so participants in research as well. So, and we also see this in terms of, as Crystal mentioned, renting out properties to people of color and providing loans to people of color. So even while individuals might not always be explicitly biased, what we see is that implicit biases, some of these explicit biases, and structural racism are often mutually reinforcing. While structural racism has created racialized barriers to opportunity, implicit biases reinforce these barriers and are a mechanism through which it continues to operate. What is important is to acknowledge that because implicit biases are so hard to detect and because they operate in subtle ways, they can be held by anyone. It is important to know and continue to discuss how much of this discrimination operates so that we can be better equipped to combat it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we give our whole panel a round of applause? And I'm also so grateful that they stuck to the time limits, because it means that it was very hard, I know. Because it means that we have more time for discussion and also questions from the audience, etc. Now, some people may be thinking, even though I think the panelists have made the case, but some people may be thinking, why did you create such a heavy discussion for us to have after work? And Erase Racism really believes that unless we finally get around to honestly confronting structural racism, that we are not really going to make the progress that we need to make. And that's why we had the topics that we had this evening, and that's why we're so pleased that the Unitarian Universalist congregation at Shelter Rock stepped forward to really fund this initiative. Please help me thank them. And I've got to tell you, you don't find a lot of funders who are, their eyes kind of glaze over a little bit once you start the discussion. So we're really pleased. And you may have noticed that we've been in the media a lot this week. On the Brian Lair show, etc. And several folks came up today as well. And that would not have happened without some additional funding from the Roush Foundation to support some communications assistance. So let us also thank them. So I'm going to kick off the question, and then we're going to have the panelists have some discussion amongst themselves. And I've asked them to both share their observations that relate to what they have heard and in connection to what they were presenting, and then we're going to open this up to the audience for questions. So for the first question, I guess I would like you to help the skeptic that says, I hear all of this, I hear this history, I hear this information about disparities, I hear all of that, and it's hard for me to believe that this isn't somehow related to the African Americans, for example, who we've talked about as being on the bottom when it comes to the racial hierarchy, etc. Talk to the skeptic about, to reinforce why this is really true and why we have to go the route of the peeling back the onion around all of these issues. And you have a couple of mics in front of you there. Who would like to go first?
Talk to the skeptic.
I'll give it a move.
Yeah, we gotta get you turned on there.
Only problem is Chris is hidden by the podium, so people.
We'll move the podium.
Is it working? No.
The light on?
No.
There it is.
Okay. Well, I would sort of look at the skeptic and sort of make my appraisal, but my sense is probably that skeptic is going to be a white person. And in that case, and assuming this person is from Long Island, I would get them to reflect on their own experience here on Long Island. And I would ask them to think about the place that they grew up. Likely that's a place where the neighborhood doesn't reflect the demographics that Elaine showed us at the first, where you actually have a mixture of different kinds of folks. Likely, it was a neighborhood that was mostly white. Get them to reflect on why that is. And get them to also think about, well, there might have been other people in other parts of Long Island, and get them to think about what they know about Long Island and where poverty is on Long Island and where disadvantage is on Long Island, and to start asking questions about the sort of ratio-ethnic groups who might be in those places. This is built in, and it's built in such a way, this structural the racism is built in such a way that it's kind of hard to see. It kind of is invisibilized, the racial disparities and differences, until you start to look at them consciously and deliberately. You need to do that in order to see all these effects that we're talking about. So that's one thing, one approach.
Did you want to have that? Go ahead first.
I mean, the skeptic, what can I say? One thing I can say is that I don't spend a lot of time trying to convince people who are like, hey, racism, that doesn't exist. Because, there are a whole set of empirical facts, whether we're talking about history, social psychological research, lots of sociological research on discrimination in every sphere of life. There's some people who can't be convinced because they don't want to be. There's some people, and maybe you've had conversations with them, that you could give them all kinds of facts, and you know what they'll give you? Alternative facts. They'll talk about black on black crime when we're discussing systemic biases in policing and in incarceration and so on. So sociologists have studied this too. There's a sociologist named Joe Fegan who developed a term that's called the white racial frame, and by the way, he's white. And what is the white racial frame? The white racial frame in Joe Fegan's work is basically the racial worldview that white Americans are socialized to have, to go back to the notion of culture. So we actually have to link this to segregation. When we talk about segregation, we have to be very clear that in the United States, segregation is not like some non-racial, fell from the sky phenomenon. Segregation has been imposed by white people. So in fact, it has been historically and into the present day, really white supremacist segregation. And so what happens when white Americans decide to live almost exclusively amongst themselves, despite the fact that we have a great deal of racial and ethnic diversity in the nation? Well, it gets to some of what my colleague Chris Sellers was describing, that folks become socially and culturally isolated from the realities of the society in which we live. And so research has also shown that the vast majority of white Americans have no meaningful relationships with people of color, right? In fact, some research where, you know, white folks say, I have a black friend. When you ask them, can you name them? Many cannot because they don't really have those friends. So, you know, so what happens when we live in these segregated silos? Well, for white Americans, it means that racism is something they don't have a lot of empirical knowledge about. By that I mean they don't study it. I teach a course in race and ethnicity here at Stony Brook. I tell my students at the beginning of the semester, you are already among some of the most educated people in the history of this country around issues of racism simply by showing up for this class. And that shows you a lot really about, you know, how little our society values education around these issues. And I think groups like Erase Racism, many of the educators and community leaders in this room are really far from that norm, but that is the norm. A society that does not teach its own history around race and racism. And again, a society that has been segregated largely through the intentional acts of white Americans who have decided to live their lives in isolation from people of color. So that's what I have to say about skepticism. Joe Fagan, when he talks about the white racial frame, he argues that white Americans routinely deny that racism exists as part of their cultural practice. The denial of racism is not just about the denial of racism today. It's about the denial of the impact of the past on the present. So it's about historical illiteracy. It's about sociological illiteracy. So my advice to the skeptic is to go lock yourself in a library and read, and read, and read, and read. And to continue your education because, you know, again, some people, they can't be convinced, and it's not my job to convince them. I can tell you to go educate yourself and try to provide resources for those who have the intention of not just learning this history, but seeing what can we do about it.
So I guess that the only thing that I have to add in this discussion about speaking to the skeptic is something that I think is oftentimes overlooked when we discuss the skeptic, and which we have to begin to find a way to kind of confront in public, which is fear. And I think that this is an aspect of what is being discussed, is that when you're speaking about a skeptic, right, it is based on the assumption that their position is based on some type of like a rational perspective. And as has just been described well, there is lots of evidence out there in the world. We're in the age of the internet. Almost anything you can look up. So when you come to look at the persistence of a type of ignorance and the persistence of learned ignorance and ignorance which is chosen, I think we have to start to talk about fear. And the fear of really trying to confront the reality that everything you know about yourself and your family and your history within the country, everything that you learned about the fact that you worked hard and you pulled yourself up by the bootstraps and you deserve everything that you have. Yes, you may have worked hard, but because other people are not where you are does not mean that they haven't worked hard, right? And so there are the ways in which what has just been described as the white racial framework has really personal stakes for lots of people. And you can't convince somebody out of their fear. This is a part of their self-identity. So when we talk about the skeptic, I think we almost miss the point when we think, okay, I can give them the best argument, I can offer them the right book to read. There has to be a way, perhaps in this room we can start to talk about it, that we begin to give people spaces to talk about their fears and their real lack of sense of identity apart from whiteness, apart from white culture, which is insufficient in the world in which we live, right? We live in a world in crisis. the old things that helped you feel like you would have a future if you went to school and you were a white man and you got your trade and all, those things are not working for people in the same way anymore. So I think that that's what is also important, that when we are doing this work, it helps everybody. It helps the skeptic, right? We are trying to really create a new way of operating within our society that can allow people to flourish, not be caught in their own houses, afraid of everything, afraid of the Bronx, afraid of Iceland, afraid of the future, right? So I think that this is what I would add. It's not all about the facts. There needs to be a place to really start to talk about people's identities, people's consciousness, and people's fears.
And I just wanted to add one more thing to that, which is that to a certain extent, like the perpetuation of inequalities in the system kind of ensures that while we are unaware of them, we can continue to be comfortable, right? And we can have like this kind of almost this fake sense of everything's going to be fine, everything's stable. But the important thing about kind of gathering these facts and talking to people about their experiences, whether it's people who feel skeptical or it's people who have experienced these discriminatory acts or racism in any form, is that we all have to really get prepared for the idea that we are going to be uncomfortable. Like, there's no part of this that's going to be a breeze, because it is, in fact, we are all in fragile positions of power, and we are holding on to it as much as we can, but we are going to all be uncomfortable because we have to understand that it isn't, our positions aren't really, the hard work, as you were saying, isn't really what has gotten us this place. And without considering like the positions that we have kind of taken away and gathered to get to it.
Well, I mean, I think everything that has been said is kind of can go together in a really productive way. Whether we're talking about what book to read, the conversation to have, the feelings and emotions that people have, I would just also add that as part of kind of challenging the white racial frame is to center the perspectives of people of color, to center the perspectives of indigenous people, of African Americans, of Asian Americans, of Latinx folk, because that's what the racial frame refuses to do. The white racial frame reproduces the perspectives, including the emotions of white people. White people talk about their feelings and their fear all the time. The politics of fear rule our society when it comes to representations of race. The way that minorities get framed as dangerous people, that Mexicans get slurred as rapists by our current president. But we can go down the line. There have been many presidents who spoke in the way that Donald Trump does about minorities. And I outline many of those presidents in my book. And you know, there are other people in the room who have done this work as well. So I think that even if when we're talking about emotions, whatever, we have to center the emotions of people of color, just like Abena was doing, right? Saying, let's think about the perspectives of people who have been exposed to racial terror, right? And I think we have to center indigenous folks in that, and black folks and Asians and others and Latinx. So just, I think if you're gonna go to the library or you're gonna go to a support group, you still need to be centering the perspectives of people of color.
So I'd like to open it up so we can get some questions, and I'm also going to at the same time put up our next live polling question, and you can answer that at your leisure. So do we have someone that has a question, and we have a mic running around? So over there.
I guess my basic question is, there's a number of things that you people seem to left out in a certain way, okay? I don't know if you haven't mentioned a very, very important book that came out just the last couple of years called The Color of Law. And everybody should read that, because we're talking about systematic racism, that thing documents day after day after day, you know, since the beginning of this country, how segregation and all these other things took place. The second thing is you might try to read, there was a lawsuit put in by an organization called Court, okay, which was decided at least at the first level by the federal district judge of Eastern New York, which is Long Island, okay, in 2014. And it lays out greatly how people have expressed in the zoning, what's about zoning, and how people have expressed their racial animus. Of course, it's all through code words. But the judge lays out again and again and again how all these code words mean, we don't want those people here. Okay? I mean, that's not some other place in some other time. Okay? That's today on Long Island. Okay? The other thing one could do, which I noticed you sort of did it, if you make, which I used to do with my urban economics students at Stony Brook, if you make a graph by census tract with little pie charts that show the percentage of black and white there, and you look at Long Island, oh, it's just absolutely amazing. Okay, you see a white sea with dots of black. I mean, if you want to know where, segregation, that's it right there.
Yep, and we did show a map earlier when we first started.
The one by census tract is, believe me, much more stark.
So, do you have a specific question? Or do you want to move to the next person?
Why haven't you mentioned, we were talking about, racism since the beginning of the country. Actually, if you go back to 1490 or something like that, there was what they called a papal bull put out by the Catholic Pope at that time that's called the Principle of Discovery. That says if Catholic or not Christian nation, white Christian nations meet another nation which has other kind of people, they have a right to enslave them, period. And that actual principle, you might think, well, that's 1490 something or other, that was used by the Supreme Court in a decision sometime in the early 2000s.
Okay, thank you very much.
Could we,
Do we have
just
the mic
respond
back
to
on?
that?
Sure.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to, there's actually an alternative historiography that has emerged over the last 30 years. Historians have been very busy, social historians, taking apart a lot of these narratives that we've been critiquing. And the Color of the Law is just one sort of synthesis of a lot of work that's been done. But Long Island is right in the center of that. If you look at where the sort of the clusters of African American residents are today, the main clusters, you can take it all the way back to the 1920s. And those are also the same places, a lot of them, where African American clusters of folk had congregated in earlier eras. I mean, you can also take apart this whole story about the move to the suburbs after World War II is just about whites moving out from the city. Actually, the proportion of blacks in Suffolk County actually gained more than the proportion of whites in that very time period. But their whole story is left out of how we understand post-war suburbanization on Long Island. Sure, yeah, it's a story about segregation, but it's also a story about, all of these groups moving out. So that's just one of many ways that we need to work to take apart our inherited history, our inherited stories about who we are and where we are today.
Thank you. Some other questions? Okay, then we have some over here too.
Do you believe that racism has decreased or increased? And tell me why, in your own personal opinion. That's a question for the panel.
Maybe, can we collect a few questions and respond to a bunch?
Yeah.
Sure. Let's get some other questions.
Your presentations were magnificent. My question is, do you think there are many doubters here?
No.
And if you don't think there are many doubters here, it might perhaps be time for us to talk in a more intimate grouping.
Yes. Yes.
That's plural.
I appreciate
Thank
that,
you.
Barbara.
And let's take two more, and then we're gonna have some responses.
Hi, I'm a teacher in one of the whitest districts on the island and one of the most diverse districts on the island. And I just had, I guess it was a question for the whole panel. What advice would you have for a teacher whose students, both white and of color, have internalized white supremacy? So a whole room full of skeptics on all sorts of the racial spectrum.
And the final one?
Final for this round.
Right.
Oh. Hi. I was just hoping you could explain a little more about the colorblind issue and why that's something that is not constructive or helpful or might even be something that's not desirable.
Can you say a little more about what you mean by the colorblind issue?
Someone mentioned colorblind, that being that I'm sorry that you if you don't see color,
Gotcha.
that I took the presentation
That's
to
a
me
problem.
that's not a good thing.
Gotcha.
I wanted to understand what that was about.
Let's just start there and we can move down the line in a second.
Yeah,
Pieces of whichever
I can address a couple. I think it's interesting, the question about racism decreasing or increasing. You know, it's difficult to say racism per se, but I think we are seeing a resurgence. I mean, there's little doubt in my mind that there's a resurgence of explicit public expressions that are racist, are outright racist. That we're in a time when that has, however it's happened, it's become more publicly acceptable across much of American society. I think that surprises a lot of us because we had thought that I'm speaking for myself, but I know probably for other people, that after the civil rights movement, people were shamed into not being as public about their racism. And yet here we are today, for various reasons,